Welcome to Fleet News Group podcast, where we talk about all things fleet, and particularly about the shift to lower emissions. I'm Caroline Falls, and today I'm talking with Lex Forsyth, CEO of Janus Electric, an Australian startup that converts diesel engine prime movers to battery electric. I met Lex at the Brisbane Truck Show earlier this year, and his stand was always crowded. So welcome, Lex.
Thanks, Caroline. Appreciate having us on.
I have so many questions for you. Like, it is so interesting what you're doing, but for the benefit of our audience, let's get you to talk about Janus Electric, when it was founded, how is it financed, and what sort of trucks you can convert.
Yeah, so Janus was started back in 2020. My co-founder and myself came together with a bit of an idea on electric trucks, and thought the future of transport and trucking was battery electric. We couldn't make hydrogen stack up when we did the numbers, and then we thought, well, let's give this a go and take an old prime mover, which was 10 years old at the time. And we decided to give the first one a go and get a rolling prototype. It took us about 3 months to get a rolling prototype, and we had some really great engineers and people that have come along on the journey. We've now got a team of 44 people working in the business here, and orders for about 100 and I think close to 145 or 150 trucks now Australia-wide. And it's been a ride as we've come along in the period. So, the first 2.5 years it took us to build the first 5 trucks, and in the last 5 months we've subsequently built another 11. So we've been moving along really quickly at the factory. I think we've got trucks 17 and 18 coming through the factory at the moment.
So you've been busy, and that preempted my next question, like how many trucks. But from a video from the truck show in Brisbane earlier this year, I see that you have converted trucks to electric for companies like Cement Australia, CHL, and so you've sort of said how many you've done to date, but how many are in your pipeline? And just another question, like, what motivates your customers to get the conversion done?
Look, I think there's a number of, there's always a push to zero emissions and doing something better, but there's also an the economics of it come into play, and it makes sense to convert an old vehicle from diesel to electric. Obviously, with the maintenance savings and energy cost savings, is their biggest focus is how do we get sustainability that is economically viable? Because one of the things we've got to be mindful of as a society, it's great to be 100% renewable and sustainable, but if it's not economically viable and it's going to cost us more to do it, you've got to really weigh those things up. And that's why we've sort of looked at the hydrogen thing and can't make the numbers work. And our customers are telling us the same thing. They can't see how they make certain zero emission vehicles work. So we focus on how do we make the environment the beneficial byproduct of what we do. How do we make it it's just what happens by what we do in our business, and that's sort of the way we've focused the business as we've built it. I come from a trucking background, and diesel trucks have been in my life since I was a kid. And I come from the transport industry. Bevan comes from the alternative energy industry and was built one of Australia's largest biodiesel plants. And I was his largest customer about 15 years ago in Brisbane when I had a container business. And we've talked about it, and a lot of where transport companies suffer at the moment is the lack of margin in their business. So if you can give them something that is cost compelling, where the environmental factor is the byproduct from them making the change, it's a natural progression for them to change.
Yeah, I was curious, like reading through the Janus Electric website and other materials while researching for this talk with you today, how big a market there is potentially for converting diesel trucks to electric like on your model. So like I read that the prime movers that you would convert are ideally under 10 years old, as they've got the electronics, and also that the cost of fitting an electric powertrain is comparable to fitting a new diesel engine. So how many trucks in Australia qualify? Like how many under 10-year-old trucks get fitted with new diesel engines?
Yeah, so if you look at Australia, there's about 115,000 Class 8 prime movers registered in Australia at the moment. Of that, about 68% of that is less than 10 years old, so in excess of more than half. The way the fleets are looking at this, looking at it when the vehicles are due for a diesel engine rebuild. Most diesel engine rebuilds take about 3 weeks to do in a truck, and somewhere in the vicinity of about 100, between $80,000 to $100,000 to do the full engine rebuild, particularly if you take in account all the auxiliary services such as fuel pumps, water pumps, turbos, all of those sorts of things that are on a diesel engine. When they do a conversion with us, all that is replaced new, and they also get a new gearbox that goes with the conversion. That's a cost of $175,000 on average to do the conversion for a line haul metropolitan truck. Of that, they get about $25,000 back for the gear that comes out of the truck. So everything that gets deinstalled when it's parted out normally gives them a return of about $25,000. So it's slightly dearer to do the conversion than it is to rebuild a diesel engine, but the big cost savings are obviously in energy and maintenance costs, because you remove a whole schedule of servicing out from the vehicle. You remove a whole B service because there's no oil filters or fuel filters or air cleaners to change on electric motor as you do with a diesel motor. So typically that's saving the fleet operator somewhere between $1,500 to $2,000 a service. That is over and above, and then you've also got all your brake life extension and those sorts of things as well, with the regenerative braking that you get with an electric vehicle that you can utilise the whole time.
So the battery that you're putting in, or the powertrain that you're putting in, fits into where the diesel tanks were?
Yeah, so the conversion module goes directly in where the diesel engine is. So that's where the electric motor and drivetrain, the electric motor and gearbox goes basically straight into where the diesel engine comes out of. And then the batteries that we have as a swappable battery go in where the fuel tanks where the fuel tanks were on the diesel prime mover.
Yeah, I love that swappable battery thing, and I've got a few more questions about that later. But I mentioned meeting you at the Brisbane Truck Show, where your stand was very popular. Can you tell me about the reception you got? Like, who were all those people milling around on your stand? Were they small truck fleet operators? Were they enthusiastic, skeptical, believers, or non-believers in your technology?
No, we had a mixture of all sorts of people on the stand. So we've had fleet owners to truck drivers to customers that our fleets are hauling freight for. Everyone was very interested in what we were doing, and really, even some of the OEMs were walking past. We were getting a lot of Kenworth dealers walking past, looking at what we were doing, and trying to understand exactly what it is that we've been doing, and then also asking a lot of questions about the battery technology and how the system works and those sorts of things. So it was a really good and very informative truck show.
Yeah, I'd like to know what sort of questions they asked you.
A lot of it was common questions. How powerful is it? How far will it go? It's the 720 horsepower or 540 kilowatts. How far will it go? Depends on what the vehicle's towing. Anywhere sort of from that 300 to 500 kilometres, depending on the vehicle's operating conditions and terrain and the load. How does it change gears with an automatic gearbox that we've put in there? What do we think the durability of it will be? And the interesting thing with the durability question was we're talking to Dana. I've got sort of 45,000 of these motors out in circulation now, done in excess of 2.8 billion kilometres, and haven't had a warrantable failure. So there's a lot of, the one thing around electrics is there's not a lot that can go wrong.
One of my LinkedIn contacts, Megan Cementsma from Logistics Solutions Outfit, best trained at Melbourne Institute of Technology, she urged me to follow you up, saying she heard you present at an event recently, an event about getting to net zero in the supply chain and logistics space. Look, she also made a comment about what you're doing, saying it's a game changer. So I think I agree with her, like swapping batteries out is the way to go, rather than having to set up infrastructure for fast charging of trucks in the future. And also, since it would take hours to recharge a truck, I mean, it's never really going to be feasible for long haul carriers in general in Australia, is it? Like maybe hydrogen, but as you said, you've looked at that and you find this model that you've got of swapping batteries out is the way to go, at least at the moment.
Yeah, definitely the way to go. The biggest there's a number of factors that are going to be an issue for zero emissions, and one is even the plug-in battery electric vehicles are going to have issues because you're not going to be able to get a big enough power feed to have 100 trucks at a depot plugged in, all recharging at the same time. So that's why we look at it with the battery. The battery, it makes sense for the battery to sit there and wait and take the charge when the grid's got availability and when renewables are in production is the best time, because typically when renewables are in production, trucks are operating during the day. If you look at duty cycles of trucks, there's more trucks operating on a day shift operation than there is on a night shift operation, typically across fleets. The other side of it as well too is, everyone talks about hydrogen, but they haven't overcome the storage issues or the transportation and distribution of that energy to be able to do that. And that infrastructure is not cheap. So there's a lot of challenges ahead on the hydrogen highway that I just don't think they've really thought through. I wish them well. I mean, there's no definite winner in this, but we do look at our solution and go that we think this is the most practical solution for heavy vehicles in comparison to what is out there now, and that's just where we see the future.
So Janus Electric is establishing a network of battery swap depots, correct? And
correct.
Can you tell us about that? Like where are they going to be, these depots?
Oh, well, we've already got 8 deployed. So we're building networks with our customers at the moment where we've got back-to-base and point-to-point operations. And that's where we've started. But we will electrify the Hume and the Pacific between Brisbane and Sydney and Sydney and Melbourne. We've currently got charge stations in Brisbane, one here on the Central Coast, one in Sydney, 2 in Melbourne, one in Mount Gambier, one in Port Augusta, and one heading to Adelaide very shortly, just based on where we've got trucks operating at the moment. So what we're looking at is you can't have a scattergun approach to this and have this hope. We've received no federal assistance or state assistance from any of the governments across Australia in what we're achieving. So we've had to fund this from shareholders in the business and equity raisers to be able to start to roll this network out, because we're not getting any funding for assistance with our fleets, or our fleets getting any assistance on this journey at the moment. So that being said, we've got to put the infrastructure where we get good utilisation of it, and that's the real key of what we're doing at the moment. Is we're partnering with our fleets to make sure that we put a network together that suits them, and as we build the network, we start to add more locations in. It starts to complete the ends of the network. So, with our charge station going into Moorebank in Sydney, being hooked to their huge amount of renewable energy there, that sort of fixes the top end of the Hume for us. With the charge stations in Melbourne, we've got them at the bottom end. Now we're just finding a location in the middle, and the Hume will probably be done first before we do the Pacific.
I'm not sure why you haven't received any funding. I mean, there does seem to be quite a bit around from state, federal governments. But for Australia to meet its emission targets, like what sort of incentivization for a business like yours to prosper, need to be put into place? Like, you're an innovator. That's what's needed to change things. Like, what incentives are needed to encourage you and more people and businesses like you?
I think, there used to be a business, it used to be the Commonwealth Development Bank here in Australia that lent money to help businesses grow that were in startup phases that typically couldn't raise funding from investment or from traditional means of finance, because it's a hard slog when you're starting a brand new technology business from start. That something along those lines where you can get a loan that funds this new technology that you can that meets the criteria to allow you to get further investment to grow the network. But in all honesty, I think the reality of it is we've got to have governments that stop talking about things and that start actually doing things. They all talk about how they've allocated money for projects, but it can take anywhere between 2 to 3 years to get a grant approved. It is just far too slow. And our governments have got to start to back Aussie businesses. If they want manufacturing and they want capacity built in the country to get to zero emissions quicker, you've got to back these Australian startups. And there's a lot of businesses like Janus that are in similar positions where the government just hasn't stepped in and said, we want to foster this business. We're creating new jobs. We're a regional employer. We're creating new skills. We're transitioning diesel mechanics to an EV scenario. Same with auto electricians and high voltage electricians into an automotive industry that we could be a world leader in. But there's just not the commitment from state and federal governments to go, how do we get behind these guys, and how do we remove some of the red tape around axle mass weights? Steer axle mass has been a big issue with all zero emissions trucks. How do we get a meaningful conversation around that so that the fleet operator is not penalised for going to zero emissions with a higher tare weight prime mover? Because the worst thing that we could do is increase the freight task by having zero emissions vehicles that can shift less weight. We need to really look at that and get that resolved to give the fleet operators some confidence to move forward and go, we're going to transition because we can still ship the same amount of payload with the vehicle on a zero emissions basis. Because the biggest problem is, a lot of our fleets are under a lot of strain. They can't get drivers, they can't get mechanics, they can't. They're finding it very hard to meet the freight task that they've got because of this shortage of labour and shortage of skills in the industry. So by increasing the freight task, we're only going to exacerbate that for the industry. The other side of it, I think, too, is our environmental ministers, both state and federally, need to actually come and have a look at what some of these Australian businesses are doing and going, how do we get behind these guys? How do we support them? Is it funding? Is it investing into charging infrastructure that has multi-user rather than just a plug-in model? How do we start to set up microgrids where we start to take real good advantage of renewable energy that are on rooftops? And how do we use that energy rather than just putting it into the grid? And we've got politicians there crowing about how the power price goes negative. None of the retail outlets and none of the everyday Australians see the benefit of power going negative. All we're seeing is, the politicians saying how cheap renewable power is that it can go negative. The only reason it goes negative is because the renewable producer gets paid an LGC, which we all pay for, on our power bill. So, that is not sustainable. A market going negative is not a sustainable market that will last for the long term. So we've got to really start to think about energy differently and come up with a more holistic approach that will work, and not just back a winner, because a lot of them have backed the hydrogen horse, and I just don't see it working. I do not see it resolving the issues that are there with hydrogen. You can't change the thermal dynamics and the thermal properties of the hydrogen atom, and that is a big issue.
Well, some 30% of transport emissions, come from trucks, and there's not many electric trucks on the road in Australia or anywhere for that matter at the moment. So, something's got to work, and maybe it's your model. But what sort of savings can one expect from an electric truck in dollars and time, and what other benefits are there? Like, for example, quieter vehicles open up doors for extended delivery hours in built-up areas, don't they?
Exactly. So there's some huge fatigue benefits for the drivers. Less noise, less vibration, less heat. The drivers that have been driving these trucks, when they hop out of them, have been saying that they're so they feel so amazingly fresh after operating. Yes, they are very quiet. So, I was driving this morning at 4:30. I was out doing some testing in a truck for one of our customers, and I'm driving through the residential areas because the vehicle's quiet, and I've got the regenerative braking on it the whole time. So I have less brake applications, but it's a bit like having the engine brake on without the noise, and saving on maintenance. Typically, the fleets will see a saving somewhere between 10 to 30%, depending on duty cycle and energy consumption. One of the things we haven't factored in there is the uptime that they have by the vehicle not having to be serviced as regular because of the electric motor. They're not having to do that B service, but we see there being a significant reduction in operating costs for the fleet operator that helps return some margins back into their businesses.
Finally, I just thought I'd sort of talk about Janus Electric and the circular economy. So, looking at what you're doing from a circular economy perspective, where you extend the life of raw materials or somehow keep them in the productive economy rather than useless in landfill. Like, can you tell us more about the Janus Electric system and business model, where I think you retain ownership of the batteries, and how that's optimizing material usage and assets, and is an example for the circular economy?
Yeah, so what we see, our batteries have essentially 2 to 3 lives. The first life is in transport, and we utilise them to power the vehicles. And then the second life, once that battery gets down to around 85% state of charge, we then are able to take that battery out and then utilise it in virtual power stations and in microgrid opportunities for grid stabilisation for the electrical grid, and then also utilising it as a virtual power network to supply energy that's been captured during the day and put it back into the grid during the super peak, during the evening piece where our grid is under strain. The great thing about it as well too is it also creates a demand for the renewable energy that's in production during the day. So it helps in the transition of our grid from a fossil fuel based grid to a renewable based grid.
Wow, yeah, I can see all the potential for that. That's very exciting. Thank you, Lex, for taking time out today to talk with me. It's incredible and fascinating what you're doing, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you very much for the time today too, Caroline, and thanks very much for having us on.
You've been listening to Fleet News Group podcast. It was edited and produced by Isabella Fiorentino. You can follow us on Spotify. Just search for Fleet News Group. We're also on Instagram, Facebook and YouTube. Our website is fleetnewsgroup.com, where you can get all of our stories, videos and podcasts. Until next time, drive safely and take care.